happy when I got accepted for this event. It was like, I wouldn't say a dream, but it was between my top goals to assist here besides New York. I'm part of Kaspersky Lab, Global Research Analysis team, and we wanted to talk about a little bit about YARA and how we are using it to find new samples, and during this year also to perform some incident response cases. Before joining Kaspersky Lab, I used to work as a .NET developer. That's how everything started. That's where my life went sideways. I started with .NET 1.0. I was doing custom systems. I was working with some friends, trying to make money to pay for my university. And I thought, well, okay, either I go the Java way or .NET. And I remember that day very clearly because I tried to use Java for the first time. I downloaded NetBeans, and I tried to use, I remember, a grid bag layout and tried to put just a button on the screen. And it took me like 30 minutes. And I said, no, I'm going with .NET. This is my destiny. So why speak differently about .NET? And why think about it in a different way when it comes to malware? Well, Microsoft started to think about this framework as a default component of Windows systems. Since the year 2002, it's included by default in all Windows operating systems. So, as a developer, this is extremely useful for me, but also for malware writers. When you know you can run your code in every Windows system and you can access Exchange credentials, you can access Active Directory, you can access SQL Server straight from .NET, it becomes a superb lateral movement tool. There was another presentation about lateral movement, and that's why we are seeing an uptick in .NET samples. We are seeing that the bad guys know, of course, they know about this, and they are trying to use it. So why speak about .NET? In 2015, we did a research with another colleague of mine. He works also for the research team. And we saw that every year we were getting new and new samples. If you see, for example, 2017, that number is for detections. That is the total detections that we are seeing in the lab, and it's around 300 million. So you can see it's a pretty big number, and that's why we're talking about YARA today. Because when you have 300 million detections, and you have as many, if not more, samples, then you need to find that needle in the haystack. It's very difficult to find those threats that are worth researching about, those threats that are worth for customers to pay for your threat intelligence feed. You need to find something special, and that's where YARA comes in. So, when it comes to .NET, we see some top four categories. If you see, for example, we have malware, 13%, then we have adware, then we have riskware, and I don't know if you are able to read, that one is pornware with 0%, but that 0% is 4 million detections. So some people are being naughty. Okay, everything went sideways when we started to see also ransomware created in .NET. The number of samples just skyrocketed. In 2013, we saw CryptoLocker, and since then there has been many more ransomware samples, not only with .NET, but with everything. But in this case, we are seeing Hidden Tier. That was an educational malware. And we have seen some in the wild ransomware made with Hidden Tier and .NET. This is one of the, if I don't remember incorrectly, it was Crypto 888, but it was a spin-off of a Brazilian ransomware that it was actually making good money in Brazil. So, for me, this is unbelievable. I mean, people are using open source code to create malware. We're getting new detections. We're getting new samples. We are overwhelmed by the amount of information that we have. So we need to find a way to find those samples that we want to study, that we want to investigate further. And this is where YARA comes in. So this is a Derxial sample. And this is part of another research I did with Bar Paris. It was about Steam stealers. Steam stealers try to hijack your Steam platform credentials or your account. They try to steal your inventory items, your video games. And it sounds silly, but it was a multi-billion-dollar business. So, YARA is extremely simple or extremely complex, as you want it to be. So, to write a YARA rule, and I don't know, how many of you know about YARA or have used YARA? Awesome. How many of you have used the .NET module? 2, 3? Yeah. Honest enough. So, to write a YARA rule, you just need, basically, two sections in your syntax. You have, of course, the rule name. Then you have conditions that it could be as simple as saying condition false, and that's it. But when it gets more interesting is when you start using the modules, because YARA has many more features than using just string pattern matching or using regular expressions or using certain byte at this position. You can go much, much more further than that. And this is why I started to think about the .NET module to write YARA rules specifically for .NET malware. Since version 3.6.0, they added this module. And in the beginning, I was extremely happy, and I was eager to try it. So I downloaded the latest YARA. I installed everything. I was going to run it. I wrote a couple of rules, and it didn't work. It didn't work the way I expected. And it was the beginning of this presentation, because I wrote an email to Victor Alvarez, who is the developer of YARA, and I told him, hey, Victor, I found this bug, this bug, this bug. And he told me, OK, talk to Wesley Shields. And Wesley was the maintainer and the developer of this .NET module. And he told me, OK, this is a bug, this is a bug, this you got it wrong, let me teach you. This is a bug, okay, and let me explain you a little bit more about how can you use YARA more efficiently. So he gave me a lot of tricks, tips that I'm going to share with you. And more importantly, he was willing to share that information, and that's why we are here in a B-Sides event. That's why it's important to keep sharing this knowledge. So why think about .NET malware differently? When you are dealing with traditional samples, you see that right away you go to static analysis, you try to see strings, you try to see file attributes, compilation date, things like that. But with .NET, not many people realize that you have a lot of metadata embedded into the binary. So you have, for example, this is from a ransomware that we analyzed in 2015. It was called Coinbolt. And we found a lot of information at the time. I didn't write the YARA rule back then because the .NET module didn't exist. But I remember we worked closely with the information we found in this .NET binary. We worked with the Dutch police, and they apprehended 2 guys in the Netherlands. And it was the beginning of another project that it's called No More Ransom. You can access that website at nomoreransom.org. And we began to understand how big the problem was with .NET, because you have all this information. For example, when it comes to ransomware, if you are using the .NET libraries correctly, it's impossible to get the decryption key. This is not roll your own encryption. You're using Microsoft version of the encryption, and I guarantee it's much better than anything I can write. So we started working with the police. We started working in a different way. Then you have other samples. For example, that one is another from the Steam Stealer campaign. You can see in the metadata some anomalies, like the file name. For example, they're trying to post malware bytes, but of course, incorrectly spelled. And then when you analyze the hexadecimal representation of a .NET binary, you see, of course, it's a standard PE, portable executable file. You see the MC header. Does anyone know why it's called MC? Mark Sikowski. Correct. But within this file, you also have another header. It's the header for the .NET binary. So, does anyone know why it's called BSJB? They try to replicate Marszałkowski. Those are the initials for all the people that work on this header. And they started working on this in 1998, and they thought, okay, if we're going to put this much work, then Marszałkowski is like not the only one going to get credit for this. Okay, perfect. So within a portable executable file, you have three traditional sections. You have the text, you have the relocation, and you have the unmanaged resources. Within the text section, you have within that the metadata that belongs to the .NET binary, and also the intermediate language code. As you know, .NET is not compiled code, it's interpreted code. So you have all the intermediate language bytecode embedded into there. And I'm mentioning this because writing YARA rules for .NET without knowing what you are doing, for me, it's a tricky business because every once and then you find that sample that doesn't fit how you learn to use the tool, and you are done. Okay. So what you can see here, I hope you can see it, but I'm using DNSPy. As the previous presenter mentioned, it's a really powerful tool. It's still open source, it's still free. I don't know how, but he's not making money out of this. And if you are writing YARA rules, for me it's one of the most important tools you can use, because it will give you pretty much all the information that you need to write your rules straight from here. Okay, so as far as the metadata, you have 5 streams traditionally in .NET binary. I'm not going to go into much detail into all of them, just to mention that the most important one is this, the little weird sign, tilde. So it contains the metadata tables. Within the metadata tables, you have around 41 properties that are defined, where you can find information about the assembly, you can find information about the module, you can find information about everything that is used by this binary within runtime. But I didn't want to go into much detail in the framework, so we had time to have some fun with YARA. This type of content is much better suited for a workshop or maybe a training, because the idea is that you get a hands-on practice with YARA. If you see it on a screen, it's like that phrase, I see, I forget. But when you're at home, you're listening to music, you're in Facebook, you download YARA, and you can practice all of this. You only need YARA, of course, and I'm going to use DNSPy to get the information, and then to visualize the rules or to write them, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. For me, if you're using Windows, it's a very powerful editor. It detects all of the current syntax of YARA, and it works really well. So one of the first mistakes I had that Wesley corrected me, it was how I identified global unique identifiers. So for example, if you look at the metadata of a .NET assembly, you see that the identifier, the GUID, is actually not a GUID, it's called a typelib. But somehow, the developers of DNSPy are evil enough that they are mixing the concepts. So, what you need to know is the difference between an ID and a typelib. When you are speaking about a typelib, you are referring to that specific project. So, for example, if you're working on a malware, the typelib would arrange, encompass everything in a single unit. But if you're seeing new builds of that binary, what you are trying to find is the new unique identifier. So that's a big distinction to make when you're trying to find either a malware of the same family or a new malware. Then you can inspect the assembly references. For example, we're not talking about the references of the portable executable file, but the references that the assembly is making. For example, if it's using Windows Forms, Core Foundation, Presentation Foundation, any other assembly that is part of the .NET family. Then you have the signature, the version, the build version, everything you can find in a .NET binary. And here are the references to the assembly I mentioned about. And my idea was to do this in a way that you could see where to get information and how to write a rule with that information. In this case, I'm using a sample that is called Plotus. Plotus is an ATM malware that was striking Mexico really hard. And we've been tracking the Plotus family since 2013. They are still active, and they have gone through different iterations. And lately, we found one of the latest modules in their malware by using YARA. So it's something that we are doing every day in the lab, and we found extremely useful to find new malware that we can write about, we can understand more before anyone else. So for the syntax, you can use, of course, besides the rule name, another section is called meta. In there, you can use any fields that you define. I typically add the date I wrote the rule, what it's about, what I'm trying to detect. Maybe it doesn't detect that, but that's my intention. And then you have the conditions. Like I mentioned, you can be as simple as using condition false, or you can be pretty complex using these modules. In this case, I'm using the .NET module only. You have other modules that are extremely important, but in this case, since we are trying to track just this family of malware, and I know it's made with .NET, we're using just the new module. So you can use the identifier, the type-lib, you can use the assembly references, and you can use, for example, each assembly has a public key of token. So if you are seeing assemblies that are pretty common, for example, MS Core Lib, or any other .NET assembly that is quite common, I wouldn't include it in the rule, but I would include any assembly that is custom made or it's made by the malware writer, you know, just to be used in that specific thread. So you can also get module information. In this case, we are not talking about the assemblies, but what is the file using at runtime. So for example, it's using GDI for representation. It's using kernel 32, of course, then shell 32. You know, all these modules that are part of the number of API calls that are being done by this particular malware. And then for me, this is one of the most interesting parts of writing a rule is the resources section. When you are dealing with portable executables, you already know that there is a resources section. But the .NET resources is something completely different. That's a part. So in this case, this malware was protected with a commercial protector called .NET Reactor. And using the typical, you know, static analysis tools, you wouldn't find like any useful strings. If you try to use IDA Pro or Oli Debugger, you would need to debug a lot to find something useful. And of course, you are finding that information in a dynamic way at runtime. So if you want to write a YARA rule, yes, you can use that information, but you need other tools to analyze at runtime. For example, you can use YARA with volatility. So you can use a memory dump, and you can check all the processes and see if any of those strings are matching the live processes. But my idea and what we are trying to do is to find new malware within our malware collection. So imagine if you have 300 million samples. No, you need something that works fast, and you need to analyze it statically. So for the resources, you have the size, the offset, and the name. Everything is related to the metadata header I spoke about earlier. So YARA already calculates everything for you. So for example, you have a relative offset and an absolute offset. When you're using YARA, you need to use the absolute offset. So you need to find where the beginning of the metadata header is for .NET. In this case, you can use, for example, File Manager and just F7, search, BSJB, and you will find the beginning of the metadata. Well, then writing the rule, and don't worry about writing anything down. My idea was, after this presentation, to share it with you, because I know that one of the most tricky parts about writing code for any language is to find the correct syntax. And that's why I struggle the most with this. You know, you already know what you want to write. You already know the rule. You know what you are looking for, but YARA says, no, that's not the correct way, but I'm not going to tell you which is the correct way. So in DNSpy, we can see that information too. We can see the beginning of the metadata header. In this case, DNSpy is using a relative address, so that's not the real address you're trying to use. And for example, I talked to you about the streams, that we have 5 streams, the most important one being the metadata table. So YARA, and we are trying to match a specific stream. Again, you need to find the absolute position of that stream. So if you're trying to do that, you have in DNSpy, you can browse all the streams and you would see the offset. So it's very simple. You see the offset, then you go to File Manager. Again, the best tool and free for all malware analysts. And then you just need the most useful utility in the malware analysis world, Windows Calculator. So you just need to add the metadata header to the offset, and you can use hexadecimal, but you can also use a decimal representation and write your rule with that. And this was one of my first mistakes when I was trying to write YARA rules with .NET. And Wesley told me, no, YARA is doing everything for you, but you just need to give it the right information. You need to use the absolute offset. Then, I mentioned we had 5 streams. In this case, this sample for Plotus had 7 streams. And if you check DNSpy, I don't know if you can see the colors there, but you see 2 highlighted in red. I'm guessing it's red. So those 2 streams are called GULD, and the other is called blob, not blob. So you see something is off with this sample. And when you are trying to find new malware, when you are trying to hunt for new threats, what you're looking for is anomalies. And of course, this caught my attention enough that it was worth to include in this rule. Okay, so when you are writing the rule for the streams, you can use the number of streams. You can use, again, as the resources. You can use the offset. You can use the name of the stream. And you can use the size. In this case, the size was meaningless because it was just 1. It was 1 byte. And it made no sense. But it was something that .NET Reactor adds to any sample that is being protected. So it's not a way to find new samples of Plotus of this specific ATM malware, but it was a good way to find new .NET Reactor protected samples. So if we wanted to write our final YARA rule, and you saw a lot of code that you're not going to remember about, but I'm going to share the presentation with you, that's the idea. You wouldn't use every piece of syntax available by YARA. You need to take into consideration that when you're writing a YARA rule, most likely it's going to be run against a database of malware, at least in our case. So you need to think about the performance. You need to think about what you are using against that many samples. When it comes to performance, let's say the fastest way is using bytes at an offset, then a little more slow. You can use string matching, and then the slowest is regular expressions. If you're using modules, this is even slower sometimes. Because you can also use, for example, iteration expressions. You can use a lot of properties that YARA needs to convert and then find the other value to match. So It takes a lot of computing cycles to do that. So how would the final rule for Plotus would look? I would use the type-lib. In this case, I only use the type-lib because I'm trying to find just new Plotus malware, which means I'm not trying to find a new build of a malware I already know about. I'm trying to find new malware of the same family. I'm using some information from the assembly, such as Diebold. Diebold is one of the many ATM manufacturers. I'm using the streams I mentioned about. So you have a lot of information at your disposal, but as an analyst, it's your call to decide what to use and what to leave on the side. And there is a trick that not many people that use YARA know about, and I only learned about this when I sent a message to Wesley. And he told me, Santi, why are you using dnspy? You know you can use YARA -d, and the -d flag will tell you everything about YARA and what it's doing behind the scenes. So for example, you can see all the offsets, all the names, the positions, everything. So you just called your rule where you're scanning -d, and YARA will tell you. For example, you can just write a rule that says condition false, and at the beginning import .NET module, just .NET, and run it, and then YARA will tell you, this is what I was trying to match your rule against. So you get all this information that you can use to write your own rule. So of course, you can use dnspy, you can use File Manager, you can use Windows Calculator, but if you are in a hurry, this is great. And for me it was, Wesley, why didn't you include it in the documentation? You know, it was supposed to be added, but it was left there. So for me, it was one of the most important tricks that I found, and I'm really thankful about learning about this. So the idea of this presentation wasn't just to give you the syntax. In a way, I was trying to, you know, share why using the .NET module is so important when you are dealing with different types of malware, and why you need to think about .NET malware differently. In the previous presentation about medical devices, I remember one of the bullet points that said .NET malware easy to reverse. In most cases, that's the reality. You just use ILSpy or DNspy, and you open it, and you have all the source code available. But sometimes when you have .NET Reactor, Smart Assembly, or some custom version of Confuser, Confuser EX, you're done. You need to find something else. You're going to have to open up IDA or Oli debugger. There is no way around that. So you still need to hunt for those samples, and you need to do it in a static way. So you need to find some information that is going to help you find new malware without opening IDA or Oli. If you cannot use the strings, you need to find something else. And that something else is all the metadata that you have in a .NET binary. When you're writing rules, you need to think about in which stage of your threat hunting process you are in. So what are you trying to do? You know nothing about this malware, but you heard a rumor, maybe in some group, or someone told you about. There is this malware, for example, in Mexico, attacking ATMs. So what do you know and what you don't know is just as important to write a new rule. Are you trying to just find new malware, or are you doing, for example, incident response, in which you know you need to go to, for example, a bank, run your rule in all the systems and tell the bank, okay, this is infected, this is not, we know it's Plotus or it's another ATM malware. When you're thinking about YARA and its modules, you need to think about us help to write in that specific rule you want to finally deploy in the customer or to hunt new malware. But it's not like you are going to need just this module, or for example, the PE module or the mass module. Each rule is different, And for me, using the .NET module is a good way to reduce false positives. So in this case, as a, as a training example, I just use only this module. But in reality, I would use, of course, strings, if available, the file size, the P header, any information I have to reduce the number of false positives. Because if I'm trying to run this rule against millions and millions of samples, I need to make sure that I'm not going to detect Internet Explorer or something like that. Maybe this rule is going to be deployed at your customers' systems. You don't want a call at Friday midnight, hey, this is detecting Chrome. So when using .NET, you can be sure that you are finding the correct sample, or at least reduce it to a threshold enough that you are able to find only what you're looking for. I added some additional resources. One of the best resources I found besides YARA documentation and the source code when dealing with identifiers, it was a previous presentation by a researcher from Silence. He's called Brian Wallace. And this research helped me a lot when we were dealing with the Steam Stealers campaign, because we began that campaign analyzing over 1,000 samples. Of course, we couldn't do that manually, so we needed to find a way to see which samples were the most important ones and which samples we wanted to write rules to hunt for more. So what Brian Wallace spoke about is using the IDs and the type libs to aggregate that information and to visualize it. For example, you can use, I remember he was using a Python script, so you would see in a screen all the dots, and you would see them grouped by the type lib or the module ID. So you can see which families are getting stronger, which families are the anomaly, which families are related together somehow, and then you can begin to write your YARA rule. And I was also working, and I finished this just before getting on the plane. I used dnlib to write a tool that gets all this metadata information, the same that you would see with YARA -d. But my idea was to build a tool that was responsible of getting all the metadata information, but from a large set of files. Because if you are calling YARA and scanning a single file, that's perfect. But when you're scanning an entire folder and YARA is just spitting out all this information on the screen, you need to parse it somehow and use it to get statistical information. So I did this very simple tool. I'm going to talk to you about while we watch the video. The wallpaper was my creation. It's copyrighted, but. So when you're using File Manager, you just easily can see the P header. You can just F7, look for the metadata header in .NET, and see the offset position. From there, you have your baseline, where you're going to work. So once you know where all the information is stored, you can check for the file and see what it has. In this case, I just checking if it contains or it's protected somehow. I'm using die, which is a simple tool. You can check manually if you want. And then with all the information, you can just write everything in your rule using Visual Studio Code. So you can see it takes just a couple of seconds. That's the magic of Hollywood. And then you can write your rule and run it against all the samples that you have. In this case, I had just a folder called bsites nyc, and I would run this rule, and I would test if it was giving me some positives or not. Then I was using the -d flag to get all the information from that sample, and that's how actually I was able to test all the values I was getting from dnspy and to see if it was what I was looking for. Then I was using this library that dnspy is using for all the processing that is called dnlib. It's also open source and free. So you can download dnlib and modify it to your liking. In this case, I wanted to get all the information needed for YARA and only that information. So I used dnlib and I just did a simple C# code to get all the information and export it to an XML file. So what's the idea behind that? I was thinking about something when you, for example, use EXIF tool or any other metadata tool, that you get all the information and you export it to a CSV file and you get some quick information, statistical information about the relations between the samples, which is the most important information, how many of the fields are shared between samples. So you can write a YARA rule that would yield much better results than just blindly writing about it. So this is just the XML file. It's basically YARA -D, but in the most complex way possible, writing your own code in C#. But it was fun, and it was a nice way to learn more about the .NET binary format. And then the easy way with dnSpy. So I wanted to leave some time for questions, if you want. I'm trying to finish. Thank you, Mr. Gates and Mr. Ballmer. Do you remember this clip from Saturday Night Live? A Night at the Roxbury. So if you have any questions or you want to contact me via Twitter or send me an email to get the code of the tool, it's perfect. I'm available. Yes?
Thank you. I guess my, sorry if this comes out wrong, but .NET assemblies are a lot easier to disassemble than, the standard portable executable. So I was wondering, because I'm familiar but not too familiar with YARA, could you sort of set YARA to look for intermediate assembly code? Sort of like, and like wildcard patterns and regular expressions and stuff like that?
Yeah, you can use it, but not using the .NET module. You can use it by using the bytes. Yeah, you need the bytes representation. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you. Thank you.